Good afternoon, Tom. How are you today?
Good, thanks, Carl. Good to see you.
Same, and thanks for joining us today on this video podcast. I did some research in terms of your background and some of the things you've written, and really, I'm looking forward to this session because you've got a lot of, I think, interesting things. So let's get started if you don't mind right away.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Tom, as an applied futurist, you talk a lot about finding the intersection between macro trends and the existing stresses within an organization or an industry for that matter, because this is where greatest changes happen, in your opinion. Can you apply this principle today, just in terms of whole COVID world we're dealing with and the impact on work environments and as well as our culture?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the really interesting things about COVID is that it's sort of exposed lots of pressures that were maybe there for certain organizations who were doing remote work, flexible working on a reasonable scale. But it's now revealed them to everybody because everybody's been doing some level of remote working. And it's also amplified them because suddenly we're not doing it for a percentage of the working population. It's pretty much everybody suddenly having to work from home, work remotely. And so the immediate pressures that threw up were the really obvious ones, the ones you deal with all the time. The challenges of technology and user learning and user behavior and connectivity and bandwidth and all these things. And then you very rapidly start to move into these new issues because, as we know, that technology's there, it's solid, it works. So you get people over that small hump and they get into these issues of culture and privacy and your presentation, being on camera lots of the day, and how does that change your behavior, letting people into your home. And then you're starting to get now, I think, into the really interesting pressures around the culture of work. How do we assign work to people who are working remotely? How do we manage people who we can't see out of the corner of our eyes, if they're hammering away on their keyboard or if they're just chatting away about the latest soap opera, over a cup of coffee? Without all those things, how do we change our management style, our management behavior, maybe shift from more synchronous to asynchronous working practices? How do we do collaboration in this environment? And actually, how do we do really challenging things like onboarding new members of staff? It's 6 months into this whole process now. We're starting to bring new people on, thinking about the next generation, new graduates coming along. All of those things need to be considered, and they're all creating pressure points that were already there for some organizations, but exposing them to a lot more people and amplifying them because so many more people are exposed to them.
Yeah, I think, Tom, that's one of the things I think we should consider is really, I think the burden really in many ways is going to fall upon the management team, because they're the ones that, number one, have to set the change in culture, the change in expectations, right? And also in terms of how they check in with their employees and their teams. So I don't know if you thought much about really in terms of the burden and the culture really around the management team in terms of how they operate is going to be very different going forward.
It's a really interesting, again, it's a sort of amplification of an existing trend. So in my latest book, Future Proof Your Business, I wrote a whole section about how lots of the organizations I work with, the reason they're calling me is because they're sensing this need to be more adaptable, more responsive to what's going on. And one of the ways I prescribe to do that is to push more power, more autonomy, more responsibility to the edges of the organization. Equip people with the tools, both technological or sort of cultural and process, to allow them to be more autonomous, to take more responsibility, to operate with less oversight. And so COVID has really sort of accelerated that transition and really forced it on a lot of people. Do you know what? We can't use the old methods of management that really came straight out of the factory. We've got to start accepting that our organization is now lots of small units, even individuals, who have to take on responsibility for things. And we have to accept that they will then return a result to us at some point. And how they do that, we have to be a little bit hands-off about. We have to accept that people start to know their own best working days. Maybe it isn't 9 to 5, or let's be honest, 8 to 6 for most of us. Maybe it's starting early, finishing early. Maybe it's watching a day full of box sets and then blasting through the night for some people. Managers having to learn and leaders having to learn to be a bit more open-minded about this working culture.
Yeah. Tom, one of the things, you actually wrote about this a lot is you advise organizations on how to become an athletic organization. How's technology play a role in this?
So I think we've got to accept we're in this networked age now. Most organizations are shifting from being really monolithic. So, built from the ground up, often in one building or many, centered around many single offices, where really everything that makes the organization tick is largely under the roof. You've got some outsourced partners, but primarily everything's under one roof. Whereas now most organizations are a network, and partly they're a global network of individuals, a lot of them working remotely, and partly their whole business proposition, their whole value proposition is so dependent on this network of partners, of suppliers, of downstream partners and distributors, that you've got to understand that how do you maintain all those people's connections? How do you keep them coherent? How do you keep them on message? How do you take the friction out of all of these moving parts interacting continuously? And the only way to do that is technology. In many ways, you can turn it around. The only reason we've gone down this route is because technology enables it. It enables us to operate in this global, low friction, round the clock fashion, bringing together all these moving parts to deliver what the customer wants today, and then reassemble it with a different set of moving parts tomorrow when the customer's needs or desires change. And technology is just intrinsic to that.
It's interesting. I always try to find the bright side in some of the deepest, darkest things. And with COVID, one of the bright sides is digital transformation, right? We've been talking about this for a decade. And while there's some companies who've actually leaned forward in that, most have not. I would say since COVID, the February, March timeframe, everybody's been forced. And it's somewhat interesting, I find, that some of the things that we threw up as barriers while we could do things is now actually helping them survive in this pandemic environment, right? Talk more about kind of the future of workspaces and the art of collaboration, if you will.
So you're absolutely right. And one of the things I argue is that most organizations are terrible at proactive transformation. Generally require some external impetus like COVID to really push that change through and force people to make those dramatic shifts. And they're doing it now in terms of technology, but they're also doing it in terms of culture. There's some really interesting programs, projects going on to shift corporate culture to take advantage of these technologies. And where we're going is interesting. I think the initial response from a lot of organizations as well, the office is dead, right? The office is over. It's going to be remote working from now on. We've all seen the benefits. And I think where we've got to now is a bit more of an equilibrium position where people have recognized the weaknesses in that argument. But I think undoubtedly we're going to be working in a world where there are fewer offices. They're probably smaller. People aren't going in there day in, day out. But they are taking advantage of the things that the office offers in terms of that ability to do that high bandwidth, short-term collaboration, but also taking advantage of the technology to its maximum potential. So working sometimes synchronously with that sort of digital communication, sometimes asynchronously. And I think we're all having to get much better at managing our workloads. And you mentioned leadership. I think there's a real role for leadership here to say, how do we allow people to work with maximum productivity, but also maximum quality of life? We want to set you those two objectives and want to maximize both because we think we can do it. Where it goes from here is going to be interesting. I talked about that shift from monoliths to networks. More and more we're seeing the default position where we have enterprises not considered as collectives, but as these networks of augmented individuals, people who've got the power of technology at their fingertips and now even allowing them to do more with less, where they can collaborate very, very rapidly to solve problems. Quite often these sort of individuals with a broader rather skill set, some people with a deeply technical skill set, but lots of people whose primary characteristics are really about creativity, problem solving, communication, coming together with on-demand knowledge to solve big problems, and then jump into a different team to solve a different one. So you look at the shape of the future of business and the future of work culture, you're really going to see this change in skill set we require from people. There's going to be very little hiding inside the organization because we're all going to be responsible for presenting, for winning work, for collaborating. And then this ongoing shift in technological augmentation. I like to look back at the history of the technology that we're using today. And you go back 60 years, you and I wouldn't have been interacting sort of digitally. If we wanted to interact with a computer at all, it would have been punched cards or a green screen, one terminal in the middle of an air-conditioned room with this giant mini computer, if we were lucky, in the background. So today, where the interactions with us and technology are really, really low friction, like if we want to find an answer or empower ourselves to do something extra with technology, it's right there at our fingertips, or even just with a voice command. It's so straightforward now. And you fast forward that a few years, and you start to see this interesting picture where you've got these individuals augmented by technology, probably some combination of artificial intelligence and mixed reality, that gives them this super low friction interface, both to other people that they're collaborating with, who can almost appear in this virtual environment around them, but also to the AI assisting them that's dynamically finding answers to questions before they've even explicitly asked them. So I think the next few years look really, really interesting as long as you've got that sort of skill set and you develop that skill set to operate in that very networked world.
That's it. Very interesting. Tom, let's shift gears to thinking about kind of different verticals of industries, because this is one of the things that I really dive into in my own thinking and reading in terms of anytime these major transformations, there's disruption. And if there's not transformation, there's challenges. So let's think about some verticals in your mind and any predictions you've got about how they're going to change kind of their workflow and their environment when it comes to things like healthcare and transportation, manufacturing, all which has clearly been disrupted dramatically in this pandemic. And I'm assuming they're all working to transform. Some of you can see in healthcare in terms of telemedicine, et cetera, but thoughts around kind of the industries likely to get disrupted and how they're transforming.
Take healthcare as a great example, which I spent this morning looking at. Healthcare is facing this perfect storm, really, where you've got this combination of the pandemic they're facing, combined with big issues around international migration, with the rather fractious relationship between certain countries right now, in terms of, and lots of public political conversation about the flow of labor across borders. Lots of healthcare labor comes across borders here in the UK, there in the US. So that's a real challenge for them. How are they going to find the labor in the next few years to enable them to keep working, both in an acute healthcare scenario, but also in in a care and a social care scenario? You combine that with the existing crisis we know we have around obesity, and then also the aging population. Fascinating report out of Washington University recently about how fast our populations are aging around the world. So already this high pressure on our healthcare environment in terms of taxpayers contributing into the system or insurance contributing to the system versus people largely drawing on it. Those numbers are going to flip within the next 50 years. So particularly in the healthcare environment, people are really looking at, first of all, operations. Like, how can I run a healthcare scenario with this combination of talent and technology and people and places in a way that's both really, really efficient, but also really adaptable? Because I don't know what crisis is coming next. How can I ensure that we can respond rapidly to the next pandemic, or to some of the impacts of climate change, for example? Obviously in California, we've got the fires at the moment, dramatic increases potentially in respiratory diseases. You need that rapid response, that adaptability. And that's one of the big things they're considering right now. After years of focusing on how do we do more for less, it's how do we build the maximum adaptability into the system, and actually how do we start to leverage technology and automation to overcome some of those labor challenges. Transportation, again, is something I've looked at quite a lot recently, where the COVID crisis has created really the impetus for looking again at how we build transportation infrastructure. How do we think about the daily commute? How do we think about planning for peak times? How do we think about whether people have to travel and when people have to travel, and then put that into our planning? So right now we overbuild all our transport infrastructure, maybe 30 or 50% over what the average demand is to cope with those big peaks. Could we do some really interesting stuff, leveraging the technology that allows people to work remotely and flexibly, to say, actually, let's time shift people's commuting hours so that we don't have to build so much infrastructure. And as we start to see more and more sort of autonomy in transport, I think we're probably 30 years out still from fully autonomous vehicles of sort of class 5. But lots we can do around the design and build of mass transit, individual transport, things like making cycling easier, but is a particular sort of focus here in the UK right now. All of those things have been thrown into the question's been thrown open again by COVID, if you like, the last few weeks, and COVID demonstrating what the alternatives are. When it comes to manufacturing, that's possibly the best example of this shift from monoliths to networks. I had a really interesting conversation with the creator of WikiHouse the other day. I don't know if you've come across this project, but basically an open source house. And they're sort of promoting this interesting idea of networked manufacturing, where, just as I talked about how these networks are much more responsive than the monoliths of old, actually shift that into a manufacturing environment where you have these sort of small local factories building different components for, in this case, housing, but it could be for any sort of manufacturing project, where these small factories can rapidly adapt to new demands. They can scale up and scale down quickly. And again, they can leverage technology and, you know, the digital to digital, machine to machine aspect of this communication technology that allows them to move information, shift control, automate control so much more easily. And even really small manufacturers, we're starting to see recognize the opportunities in Internet of Things, machine to machine technology, and start to leverage that now.
It's interesting, Tom, you say, as you kind of talk about those three verticals or industries, that's one of the things I really challenge my sales team to do is really, we have to sell differently, because we have to understand the things they're going through and what's likely to become of those industries, and kind of sell to where they're going, not where they are. So it's a real change for our team, and we're trying to work through that as well. Let's kind of move, Tom, to kind of some demographic kind of things like cities and things of that nature. You write a lot about the changing role of the city. And kind of how have the trends that were already in motion pre-COVID been accelerated or changed with the emergence of COVID? Because I hear things like, people are trying to really quickly, exit New York City because they want to get more space and things like that. I'm sure you see some things in London, same kind of thing. What's your thoughts in terms of about that trend in terms of the motion of the cities where they were pre and post pandemic?
So there's a really interesting tension here, and tension is one of the most fascinating places to look when you're trying to understand the future. And that tension is between, as you say, people recognizing they can and deciding that they want to get out of the city. And that's particularly your demographics, your age groups who are probably in their late 30s, 40s, 50s, kids of school age, jobs and careers in the right place. Financially finding themselves very secure and in jobs where they can work remotely. And we're seeing, this is anecdotal at the moment, we're seeing lots of spikes in house prices in really attractive parts of the British Isles, where people can decide they can go and live on the coast now. They can go and live in the Highlands of Scotland and actually telecommute their work remotely. Counter that with some of the big incoming trends that are facing us and the big incoming challenges that are facing us. And I mentioned two already, one of them being climate change, where actually living in a city, a densely packed city, is one of the greenest things you can do. Your energy footprint, your carbon footprint, when you're in a city that's going to be 1 to 2 degrees warmer than the countryside, where you've got easy access to all the amenities on your doorstep, where you can use public transport very, very easily. We really need to be moving people into more densely packed city environments. It's challenging in a pandemic, but if we're going to challenge climate change without dramatically cutting the population, that's a big driver. And then you post the aging challenge as well. I talked about this before. The global population is aging much faster than we thought. We're going to see countries like Italy with their populations halving perhaps within sort of 50 years after the middle of the century. That's a very, very dramatic shift that you have to cater for. And how do you look after these people for whom we're not going to have a chance to dramatically change their health, ensure that they live a really long, healthy life, even if we started now? So how do we ensure that we can afford to care for these people? The only way to do it is to bring them into more densely populated areas where the healthcare services, where all the amenities, where all the cultural amenities are right on their doorstep. So a lot of people are forecasting this sort of flight from the city. Actually, I think it's probably going to go the other way ultimately. I think we're going to have much more densely packed cities. We're going to see a lot of retail estate repurposed into housing, schools, continuing slow rise of these sort of or return to health actually post-pandemic, things like coffee shops, restaurants and bars. But cities really become 24-hour cities. Every city has to be a 24-hour city. Smaller retail footprint, big residential footprint, and lots of the services that are currently distributed around the suburbs and the outskirts brought much more closely to the center.
It's interesting. I think I was talking to somebody the other day and I just made the comment, you can live anywhere as long as you have two things: broadband and Amazon. We just want to simplify things a lot when you get that thinking.
And that's true in certain parts of your life. But actually, you think about the first 25 years of your life, 25, 30 years, here in the UK, we're finding the age at which people find a partner, have their first child, learn to drive, buy a house. All those things are moving back and back towards 40. at quite a rate as well. So you have this extended adolescence of the first 40 years of your life, where when you're looking for a partner, when you're looking for the right job fit for you, when you're doing all these things, you want to be in a really densely packed environment where there are lots of potential partners and lots of potential jobs around. Once you get past that point, absolutely, you can disappear to anywhere in the world, quite frankly, and work from there. But then as you get later in life again, suddenly Amazon becomes less important, and how close is the doctor's surgery becomes more important. And,
Right.
how close are my relatives or my care workers who can come and look after me? How close are all of these the cultural amenities? Perhaps you've lost a partner, you're a bit lonely, you want to get back into some of these social groups and cultural amenities. Suddenly living in a dense environment becomes much more attractive again. And so I think we probably are going to see this flight from the cities of people in that probably sort of 35 to 55, 60 age group, but then perhaps a return to the cities as people get older in life again.
Interesting. Let's talk about, one of the things I kind of think about a lot and actually worry about it with my team is this kind of notion of self-care. People now feel like they're just constantly tethered, not only to the desk, but to the screen. To your comment earlier, they're always on in terms of being on the stage, the video. What's your prescription for people that feel that way, and really around self-care and recharging versus just enduring through the process? We know we've got this Zoom fatigue people talk about. Any thoughts you have on that?
It's really interesting because I feel terrible preaching about this, because I think it took me 10 years of self-employment to really learn these lessons myself. And I hope by talking about them, other people can learn them more quickly than I did. And the first thing you have to do is kind of forgive yourself, right? If you've been brought up in a 9 to 5, or like I say, 8 to 6 or 7 to 10 environment, get out of that mindset. Stop thinking about how much work you do and start thinking about how much value you add, and measure yourself purely on the value you're adding, not the effort you're putting in. And once you make that shift, and it is really difficult, you start to recognize that, do you know what? There's no point in me being sat here staring at my screen. There's no point in me even joining that meeting if I'm not going to add value. If it's 11 o'clock in the morning and I need a nap or a donut, go and have a nap or a donut. If you need to go and play 2 hours of Nintendo because your brain just is not in the right space, go and play 2 hours of Nintendo. Hit your deadlines, deliver on your expectations, over deliver if you can. But listen to your body, listen to your mind, listen to your brain and your soul, about what it is that it's telling you it needs. And just before this call, it's a beautiful day outside. I've been sat here since 6:30 this morning. I was like, right, do you know what? I've got stuff to do, but I have to get out. If I'm going to be sharp for this call, I've got to go out, and I've got to go and walk around the block, walk around the park, enjoy the sunshine, and do it. And it does, nothing's more important than me delivering that thing, rather than feeling like I've put in 8, 9, 10, 12 hours of effort today. And it's, I think people need to get into those habits and listen to their body. And the one that I'm really obsessive about is listening to your body clock. We have this, we force people into this weird working schedule where we expect you in the morning, leave at night, and we frown on you if you leave too early, and we frown on you if you come in too late. And I'm an early riser, but I'm pretty hopeless, in the afternoons, by and large. I'm great doing calls because it's inspiring and it's engaging. People are asking me questions. I cannot sit and write in the afternoons. So I don't even try now, right? Just forget it. That's not how my body clock works. Shouldn't be trying to do it. And if you're an owl, as they say, if you're much better, 11 o'clock in the morning through to 11 o'clock at night, learn that, leverage that. Set your working schedule to take advantage of what your body tells you is best.
It's interesting because, I think a lot of people probably thought about that in the past in terms of when they're at their best and when they're not. And it's probably good for people to reflect upon that and really give some thought in terms of that, and then apply it to their working things, their schedule, if you will. And, another thing I think about often is, we think about recharging, and people used to take vacations normally to kind of one of the reasons why they would recharge. But I don't see people doing it because they don't feel safe where they want to go from a travel perspective, et cetera. What's your view of vacations today in the current COVID world, and how's that changed in the post-COVID world, just in terms of getting away so you can recharge and come back? Thoughts on that?
I think we're going to see quite a shift in the nature of holidays the next few years. I mean, partly now you've got this flexibility, and as I say, people buying homes later. What you could do is just go and work in a different place. As they say, a change is as good as a rest. go and rent a home on the coast for 3 months. And if you still keep working, but do it in a different place with a different daily schedule, a different environment, different food, different people. So I think we'll start to see people, recharging actually by not necessarily taking a break, but doing things differently. But when people do go away, I think the combination of the pandemic potential, the need for potentially quarantining at either end, but also actually the growing recognition of the carbon footprint of travel. I think what we might see people doing is actually taking fewer big holidays, but longer. So, I mean, rather than the 2 weeks every summer where they get away to a Greek island or, a different part of the US or down to Mexico, instead, actually, they're saying, I'm going to take 3 months. I'm only going to do it every 2, 3, 4 years, but we're going to take a complete sabbatical. We're going to do something completely different. We're going to go and travel around Asia. We're going to go and enjoy all the great cities of Europe. And we're going to go and live in a rented villa on a lake in Vancouver, whatever it may be, but do these things for a really extended period and step right out of your career almost for 3 months at a time, because you can, because it has a much lower carbon footprint, and because the nature of work, will start to be a bit more flexible about those things. But in the meantime, I think you're getting away closer to home for those short breaks that just snap you out, ideally analog weeks, where, as I had a few weeks ago in the north, much further north of England, where the only way I could get a signal on my phone was walking to the end of the farm track and holding my phone in the air. I think that those breaks are really, really valuable. And I'm seeing lots of people, there's a very strong market in camper vans, in RVs here at the moment, because people are recognizing that they're going to want, they maybe can't go abroad quite so often, but they do want to get away for a week on a campsite or a week somewhere beautiful, just to really snap out of this constant digital presence.
Yeah, I've heard people talk about, digital sabbatical, which it would be interesting, kind of to your point, for people to go do. Hey, Tom, let's close on this one. Really kind of some advice for leaders out there in terms of, you talk about those who stay focused on the future, the ones who prevail. And how does somebody do that in such an uncertain world in terms of really focus? And I guess that lastly, what's your secret to staying optimistic during the COVID environment?
Well, I'll start on the optimism piece. I always say I'm a long-term optimist and a short-term pessimist. I think you've got to be realistic, right? The next few months, even the next few years, look pretty challenging. We've got a lot of challenges ahead of us, but I'm a huge believer in the power of humanity to overcome challenge, and that's why I'm a long-term optimist. And tell you, the way to stay optimistic is to look at the solutions, not the problems. Recognize the solutions. We can't avoid some of these challenges. Go and find the solutions. Look at the things we can do and take action about it. And one of the things you can do, one of the ways you take action, the way you keep abreast of what's coming, is by carving out time and space for it. And it doesn't sound like much time, but that my first prescription for any new clients I work with is I say take 1% of your time to focus on the future. 1 day every 6 months in working time, where you use a formal process to think about what's next. And I have a really, really simple process for people to use. And it's designed for scanning the near horizon. It's not about jetpacks and microchips in your brain in 20 or 30 years. It's about what are the big challenges and opportunities of the next 5 years. And you start by looking at the pressures you face today. You say, what are the challenges in the business? Go and talk to your colleagues, go and talk to your partners, talk to your customers, and understand the pressures you face today. And it's really cathartic. People love to tell you. And then look outside the organization, look at the big trends. Go and look at what's transforming industries that look like yours, or your competitors or peers, or similar industries in different parts of the world. Go and look at these big trends and look where they intersect with the pressures you're facing. And what you'll find is 5, 10, 20, 25 things where you can say, that's definitely going to affect that. And it's either going to get better or get worse. Put them in order of scale. How big's the impact going to be? How much better or worse is it going to get? Pick the top 5, deal with them over the next 6 months, and repeat the process. 1% of your time, 1 day every 6 months, focused on the future, but using a proper process to break out of the blinkers we all wear when we've been in any organization more than a couple of months.
Tom, that's great insight, and something I hope everybody gets some time to really do what you've just suggested. I think it's critically important. I want to thank you for your time today, your insight. And I would encourage anybody who listens to our podcast to really kind of start following you from a Twitter and in your blog series. I find it very insightful and just a kind of a different perspective as opposed to what you kind of read every day. So thanks for your time today. And I look forward to following you as we go forward in the future. Thanks, Tom.
My absolute pleasure.